It's now been about 6 months since Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona, and despite countless hours of investigation, search warrants, forensic testing, and national attention, one message from investigators has suddenly changed the conversation. During a recent interview, Sheriff Chris Nanos made a statement that stood out immediately. He said that nobody has been ruled out in the investigation. It was a carefully chosen response, and for many people following this case, it raised an obvious question. Why make that point now? Is it simply standard procedure in an active investigation, or does it suggest detectives are looking at the evidence differently than they were just a few months ago? The answer isn't entirely clear, but the timing has drawn fresh attention to a case that remains one of Arizona's biggest mysteries. Over the past 6 months, investigators have followed hundreds of leads. The FBI joined the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Search warrants were carried out in different parts of southern Arizona. Several people were detained and later released. Forensic experts examined evidence recovered from Nancy's home, while digital investigators analyzed phones, computers, and other electronic records. Yet despite all of that work, there has still been no arrest, no official suspect, and no public explanation for what happened to Nancy. According to the sheriff's office, the investigation remains active, and every credible lead continues to be pursued. For viewers who have followed this story from the beginning, that's both encouraging and frustrating. Encouraging because investigators insist they have not stopped working the case. Frustrating because so much remains unknown. One area that many people hoped would provide answers was DNA evidence. Early in the investigation, authorities confirmed they had recovered several pieces of DNA from Nancy's home. Among them was a rootless hair, something that immediately attracted attention because forensic technology has become remarkably sophisticated in recent years. But according to information discussed in the source material, testing of that hair has now been completed, and it has not identified a suspect. Investigators reportedly have not been able to connect the hair to anyone involved in Nancy's disappearance. That may sound disappointing, but the situation is a little more complicated. A rootless hair is much harder to analyze than one with a follicle attached. Without that root, extracting usable DNA becomes significantly more difficult. Specialists can sometimes develop a profile, but the process takes longer and often produces fewer answers. According to the discussion in the uploaded script, investigators may still revisit that evidence if a future suspect is identified, but for now, it has not produced the breakthrough many were hoping for. But another detail stood out. While the hair may not have pointed investigators toward a suspect, another DNA sample continues to receive attention. The source explains that investigative genetic genealogy is still ongoing. That process attempts to identify individuals through family relationships found in DNA databases. According to the information presented, investigators have reportedly identified some genetic connections, but those individuals have since been ruled out as suspects. Even so, the genealogy work has not stopped. As more people submit DNA to genealogy databases and technology continues to improve, investigators apparently believe there is still reason to continue the process. At first, that seemed straightforward. The DNA hasn't solved the mystery. The genealogy work continues. The investigation remains active. Then, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Chris Nanos sat down for another interview and answered a question many people had been asking for months. Reporters wanted to know whether the two men who had previously been detained during high-profile searches had finally been cleared. Instead of giving a simple yes or no, the sheriff answered, "Nobody's completely ruled out." He explained that investigators gathered evidence through search warrants, but releasing someone without charges does not necessarily mean that person has been cleared forever. He added that new evidence could emerge days, months, or even years later, prompting investigators to take another look. When asked directly whether those individuals were still being actively investigated, he declined to answer. Those comments immediately sparked new discussion. Some people interpreted the statement as evidence that investigators still have unanswered questions. Others believed it was simply a reminder that active investigations rarely eliminate every possibility until a case is solved. The sheriff did not explain which interpretation was correct. That uncertainty is exactly what has kept this investigation in the headlines. It's important to remember that law enforcement often speaks very carefully during ongoing cases. Officials may choose their words to avoid revealing investigative strategies, to protect evidence that has not been made public, or simply because they do not yet have enough information to make definitive statements. In this case, the sheriff's remarks did not identify a suspect or announce a new lead. Instead, they reinforced that investigators remain open to every possibility. That would have been the end of it. But around the same time those comments were made, another development began attracting attention. One of the men who had previously been detained during the investigation took legal action, claiming he had been wrongfully arrested and publicly linked to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. His attorneys argue that law enforcement lacked probable cause and that the investigation caused lasting damage to his reputation. At the same time, investigators have continued to keep key search warrant documents under seal, meaning the public still does not know exactly what information led authorities to those searches in the first place. Those sealed records, combined with the sheriff's recent statement that nobody has been ruled out, have created a new round of questions surrounding an investigation that remains far from over. One of the biggest questions surrounding the Nancy Guthrie investigation isn't just who investigators are looking at today. It's why certain people became the focus of such dramatic law enforcement operations in the first place. The public remembers the images well: armed officers, roads blocked, homes surrounded, search warrants being carried out by multiple agencies. At the time, many people assumed investigators were closing in on the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance. But months later, there still have been no criminal charges connected to those operations, and many of the court records explaining why those searches happened remain sealed. That has left the public with only part of the story. One of those searches involved Carlos Palazuelos in Rio Rico, Arizona. According to a formal notice of claim filed by his attorneys, Carlos intends to sue the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The filing alleges that deputies wrongfully detained him, searched his family's property, and caused significant damage during the operation. The document also claims that law enforcement publicly connected him to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance without sufficient evidence, causing lasting harm to his reputation. These are allegations made in the legal filing, and they have not been proven in court. According to the notice, Carlos was stopped during a traffic stop on February 10, 2026. He was reportedly held for several hours before being released without criminal charges. While he was being questioned, deputies also searched his family's property under the authority of a sealed warrant. His attorneys argue that investigators never had probable cause to believe he had committed any crime, and that the operation unfairly placed him under public suspicion. What makes this situation especially unusual is that the search warrant affidavit, the document explaining why investigators believed the search was justified, has never been made public. Because those records remain sealed, neither the public nor Carlos's legal team has been able to examine exactly what information investigators presented to a judge before the warrant was approved. Until those documents are released, if they are ever released, many questions will remain unanswered. That brings us back to the sheriff's recent statement. When Sheriff Chris Nanos said that nobody has been ruled out, some observers wondered whether comments like that could make it even more difficult for people who were previously detained to move on with their lives. At the same time, Investigators often avoid publicly clearing individuals while an investigation remains active, especially if they believe additional evidence could emerge in the future. Exactly why the sheriff chose those words has not been fully explained. Another detail from the legal filing adds to the discussion. The attorneys argue that after Carlos was released, officials never publicly clarified his status in a way that would repair the damage they say had already been done. According to the filing, the family is seeking financial compensation for what they describe as reputational harm, emotional distress, and property damage resulting from the search. Those claims will ultimately be evaluated through the legal process if the lawsuit moves forward. Then, something else emerged during an interview with Carlos's attorney. When asked why investigators might have focused on his client, the attorney said he did not believe there was any legitimate reason. Instead, he speculated that the investigation may have relied on electronic evidence that can sometimes be difficult to interpret, such as cell phone location data or automated license plate reader information. He emphasized that he was offering his own theory and not stating it as fact. According to the attorney, technology like cell phone pings can sometimes appear more precise than it actually is, depending on numerous factors. It's an important distinction. The attorney was not describing evidence that has been released by investigators. He was explaining what he believed might have happened based on the circumstances surrounding his client's detention. Because the supporting affidavit remains sealed, the public has no way to independently verify exactly what evidence investigators relied upon. The source material also notes that Carlos worked as a delivery driver, leading to speculation that his work could have brought him into areas investigators were examining. Again, that remains speculation rather than a confirmed explanation, and investigators have not publicly discussed what information led them to his property. Carlos was not the only person whose home attracted investigators' attention. Another high-profile search involved Luke Daly, whose home was searched during an operation that reportedly involved a significant FBI presence. His vehicle was also seized. Like the earlier search, investigators have never publicly released the affidavit explaining what prompted the warrant. Luke's attorney said he and his client had no idea why the search occurred and described the operation as baseless from their perspective. Despite those statements from defense attorneys, law enforcement has continued to say very little about either search. That silence has fueled ongoing debate among people following the investigation. Were investigators acting on evidence that simply hasn't become public? Did new information later weaken those leads? Or were the searches part of a much broader effort to eliminate every possible avenue, even if they did not ultimately produce criminal charges? For now, there are no public answers to those questions. What is clear is that the investigation itself has not slowed down. According to an official statement from the sheriff's office, investigators from the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI continue analyzing DNA and digital evidence, while urging anyone with credible information to come forward. Officials have stressed that the work is complex and time-consuming, but they remain committed to finding answers for Nancy Guthrie's family. And as investigators continue working behind the scenes, another perspective began drawing attention, not from detectives or attorneys, but from a criminologist who believes the case may reveal something about the psychology of the people involved. As investigators continued examining evidence behind closed doors, another conversation began gaining attention, not inside a police department, but between a journalist covering the case and a criminologist who has spent years studying criminal behavior. The discussion wasn't about new DNA evidence or another search warrant. Instead, it focused on something that has fascinated followers of the Nancy Guthrie case for months: the messages that have surfaced during the investigation. According to the interview in the source material, criminologist Dr. Gary Briccato believes those messages may reveal more than many people realize, not because of what they say, but because of how they differ from one another. Dr. Briccato explained that, in his opinion, the communications appear to reflect different ways of thinking. He suggested there could be multiple personalities, or psychologies involved, rather than a single individual writing every message. He emphasized that this was his interpretation based on behavioral analysis, not a conclusion established by law enforcement. That distinction is important. Behavioral experts often analyze language, tone, and decision-making patterns to develop investigative theories. Those opinions can help generate new leads, but they are not the same as forensic evidence or courtroom proof. Even so, Dr. Briccato's comments have generated considerable discussion because they offer one possible explanation for why the messages appear so different from one another. He described one message as more aggressive and focused on financial demands, while another appeared more emotional and sympathetic. In his view, those differences suggested conflicting motivations among the people who may have been involved. Again, this remains his professional opinion rather than an established fact. Then the conversation turned toward a recent public video released by Nancy Guthrie. According to the interview, Dr. Briccato believed the wording of her message could potentially place psychological pressure on someone carrying guilt or regret. Whether that video was planned with investigators or was simply a personal appeal remains unknown. The interview makes clear that any connection between the two is speculative. Still, he argued that carefully directed public appeals can sometimes encourage reluctant witnesses, or even participants, to come forward. Not everyone agrees with that interpretation. The source also references another behavioral expert, retired FBI profiler Jim Clemente, who reportedly offered a different view. According to the discussion, Clemente believed it was possible that one individual wrote multiple messages while intentionally trying to make them appear as though they came from different people. Dr. Briccato acknowledged that possibility, saying, different investigators can reasonably develop different hypotheses until additional evidence becomes available. That exchange highlights something investigators encounter in many complex cases. Evidence can often support more than one theory during the early stages. Experts may examine the same information and reach different conclusions. Ultimately, investigators must rely on physical evidence, witness testimony, digital records, and forensic analysis to determine which explanation best fits the facts. For now, none of those competing theories has been confirmed publicly. Meanwhile, the sheriff's office continues emphasizing that the investigation remains active. Officials say DNA analysis and digital evidence are still being reviewed. Detectives continue asking anyone with credible information to contact investigators, and they have repeatedly stated that even a single new tip could alter the direction of the case. That brings us back to the statement that first caught everyone's attention. Nobody is ruled out. Those 4 words have become one of the most discussed developments in recent weeks. Some people hear them as evidence that investigators are keeping every possibility open. Others wonder whether they suggest detectives still believe important pieces of the puzzle have yet to fall into place. At this point, the sheriff has not provided additional clarification, and the sealed court records mean the public still cannot see many of the investigative details that remain behind closed doors. What we do know is this. Nearly 6 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson home, investigators have not closed the file. The FBI remains involved. DNA testing continues. Digital evidence is still being analyzed. Search warrant records remain sealed. Legal challenges connected to earlier searches are beginning to work their way through the courts. And despite months of work, authorities continue to say that they are following every credible lead. Cases like this are rarely solved by a single dramatic breakthrough. Sometimes the answer comes from a laboratory result that takes months to process. Sometimes it comes from a witness who finally decides to speak. Sometimes it's a forgotten detail that suddenly makes sense after new evidence emerges. Whether any of those developments will happen in Nancy Guthrie's case remains uncertain. For her family, friends, and the community that has followed this investigation from the beginning, the hope remains the same, that someone, somewhere, has the information needed to explain what happened and finally provide the answers they have been waiting for. What do you think about the sheriff's statement that nobody has been ruled out? Do you believe it's simply standard procedure in an active investigation? Or do you think it suggests investigators may still be pursuing leads the public doesn't know about? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this update informative, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss future developments as this investigation continues.